The topic today could not really be more appropriate at the time when the world is confronting, really in a sense, confronting twin crises. The pandemic, which has not gone away, as well as the geopolitical tensions that and the geopolitical context that we are seeing today, which is truly unprecedented in many, many respects. And so the nexus between peace, development, and of course health could not be stronger in terms of the need to make sure that we focus on these three pillars for development, particularly for development for the African continent. When the pandemic started, no one could foresee the scale and the degree of crisis that it was presenting to the world. Certainly, no one, of course, could predict the context, the geopolitical context that we are all in today. And these two crises present an opportunity for the African continent. And I will speak a little bit about that. But first, the pandemic requires us and compels Africa to relook at how we structure our public health system, our intellectual property rights system. And then, of course, the current crisis compels us to think very innovatively and to reflect on supply chains, particularly in this context, supply chains for things that are required for food sustainability. And that is wheat. As we all know, many, many countries in Africa import wheat. Africa is a net importer of food. And so anything that is related to that causes an imbalance in that food security becomes a threat to the livelihoods of many, many Africans and to the development and the health of many, many Africans. And that is why we have to look at this crisis really in a way that places Africa in a position of advantage as much as it is a crisis. Now, as you know, the AfCFTA is embedded in the Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. It is a flagship project, one of the flagship projects of the African Union, seeking to promote inclusive and sustained economic growth and accelerated integration of the continent within the context of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. Today, the AfCFTA has 42 state parties, has been ratified by 42 countries, has been signed by 54 countries, signaling the fact that our continent is turning a page from the last 65 years or 70 years of being fragmented, having different rules, different trade arrangements, smallness, being trapped in smallness of national economies, lack of economies of scale, lack of depth of industrial and productive capacity, and of course, the continued reliance on the export of primary commodities, mainly to Europe, for the last 65 to 70 years. And so this is the backdrop of the AfCFTA. This is why our heads of states have accelerated the implementation of the AfCFTA, and this is why it is so important that we aggressively implement this agreement, not only for long-term industrial capacity building, not only for long-term prosperity, economic prosperity and development of our continent, but also to address the very, very immediate challenges that confront us. We know that, for example, the pandemic has pushed back over 150 million Africans back into poverty. We know that our continent, for the first time in 30 years, for the first time in a generation, our continent entered a technical recession. Of course, things are looking are much brighter now. Things are looking better. in terms of Africa's economic prospects and projections for this year and the year and next year. And so the AfCFTA has to be a tool that will enable the African continent to accelerate recovery, to bring out of poverty this figure of 150 million people that have been pushed back into poverty as a result of the pandemic. Around the world, it is estimated that it is between 15 and 16 trillion United States dollars of cumulatively, of course, of stimulus packages, economic recovery tools that developed countries have extended to their economies with the objective of rejuvenating their economies. And many countries on the African continent, of course, are not in a position from a monetary policy space, from a fiscal policy space, they are not in a position to provide these large bailouts. And so this is so critical that at this time of these twin challenges of the pandemic, as well as the challenge of the geopolitical context, that we aggressively implement the AfCFTA to bring people out of poverty. Africa's development challenge is immense, as we all know, and according to studies by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, 2 in every 3 Africans rely on subsistence farming for food and basic livelihoods, whilst nearly 600 million Africans still do not have access to electricity. With an average GDP per capita of $2,000 compared to the global average of $10,500, and a population in Africa that is set to rise from 1.3 billion people to 4 billion people in about 8 years' time, our continent needs to be 16 times bigger than it is today. Our continent's economy needs to be 16 times bigger than it is today to elevate the quality of life of citizens and to make sure that the nexus that you have identified in the topic, in the theme of this summit, that this nexus is able to be delivered upon. We also know that climate shocks threaten to derail Africa's development gains. We've seen this in parts of the continent. We have seen it in Mozambique. We have seen it in South Africa. We have seen it across the continent where there has been, where the impact of climate change has once again been to push back people back into poverty. Estimates indicate that adapting to climate change will cost the continent $50 billion annually by the year 2050. And furthermore, losses to GDP may be in excess of about 20% in extreme temperature scenarios, which, as I've just described, cause millions and millions of Africans to fall back into poverty. To foster the development of the continent, Africa must use its vast natural resources to the benefit of the people and, of course, the economies of our countries, to strengthen intra-Africa trade, to diversify our economies, to improve our industrial base, and to build a truly integrated continent economically with infrastructure that supports trade and investment. So therefore, the development that we talk about must be inclusive, and it must ensure that all segments of our society are able to see the benefits of the AfCFTA. And this is why we have been emphasizing, certainly this is why the priorities of the AfCFTA include women and youth in trade, as well as small and medium enterprises. It does have to be, the AfCFTA does have the potential to be a game changer. We know this from the studies that have been done. For example, the study that was done by the World Bank, and I know that our dear brother, Chief Economist Albert Zifak was here this morning. The agreement, the potential that the agreement has on the impact Africa's GDP is immense. The World Bank estimates that where we implement this agreement effectively, by the year 2050, 2035, we have the opportunity to lift 30 million Africans out of abject poverty and 70 million Africans out of moderate poverty, contributing close to $450 billion to Africa's GDP, which is almost 7% of Africa's GDP, what it is projected to be at that time. Wages for both skilled and unskilled workers will be boosted by 10% for unskilled workers and 9.5% for skilled workers, again, in terms of the projections of the World Bank. These projections are very promising, they're very positive, but of course they will not happen on their own. They will require us to accelerate implementation of the AfCFTA. They will require us to be resolute in the implementation of the AfCFTA and to ensure that for the next 20 to 30 years, we have a disciplined focus that will address some of the core challenges of a fragmented market, which we have been for the last 60 to 70 years. That is why the AfCFTA is comprehensive, and that is why it has been specifically designed that it is an instrument, a legal instrument, a trade instrument that is comprehensive, that covers investment protection, intellectual property rights, competition policy, digital trade, and other areas that support a region or a country's economy. We are now in the phase of negotiating what we refer to as phase 2, which are these pillars that I've just listed: competition, intellectual property rights, investment, and so on. And we aim to conclude these pillars by the end of this year. And the conclusion of these pillars will greatly contribute to deepening integration on the African continent. And we know the potential, the transformative potential of areas such as digital trade. We have seen what digital trade has done in parts of our continent. We have seen in Eastern Africa the innovation of M-Pesa, mobile banking technologies that have enabled Kenya and the region to improve financial inclusion, to improve access to trade, and to make sure that through mobile banking systems that that enable trade, that we see a greater number of small medium enterprises, a greater number of young entrepreneurs engaging in trade, certainly in the East African community since the introduction of M-Pesa and other mobile-based banking systems that support trade. And so digital trade, we ignore it as the African continent at our own peril, but I'm happy that we are not. That is why we have started work already, not on e-commerce, but we have started work already on digital trade, which is of course a much broader definition and captures much more economic activity. It's important that we do so because, of course, the global economy is on the brink of the fourth industrial revolution. Some say it is already here. Some say that the fourth industrial revolution has been accelerated by the onset of the pandemic. And so the continent has to be ready. Africa has to be ready to participate in and to take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution, which we know will be driven by new generation information technologies, such as the Internet of Things, data processing and management, big data, data analytics, robotics, and of course additive manufacturing, which, as I say, present both opportunities and challenges for the African continent. But we know from the experience of that I've just referred to, we know from the experience of other parts of the African continent that digitization and the economy that comes with it, that it does indeed present opportunities for millions and millions of Africans. We must use these tools that I've just mentioned to strategically transform our continent from agriculture to value-added production, to agro-processing, in other words, from being mere growers and exporters of raw cocoa to manufacturers of world-class, where we use cocoa, world-class chocolate products, world-class coffee, from mining to mining beneficiation, and other minerals that our continent is blessed with. It is widely, for example, it is widely acknowledged that between Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Ghana, and to an extent Cameroon, that these countries contribute close to 70% of global cocoa availability, the raw material that is, and this is estimated to be at about $6 billion. But when the chocolate industry comes to their end, when you look at the end of the value chain of the chocolate industry, it is a $110 billion industry. And so you can see where Africa losses along the value chain as a result of capacity to process minerals and to export them as finished or value-added production. I should, however, mention that I'm very, very happy with the decision of President Akufo-Addo and President Ouattara of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, respectively. They have decided that there will be no more export of raw cocoa, that they will now focus on the production of value-added products that emanates from cocoa as a primary commodity. And I know that, of course, it will take time. Our heads of states, these two heads of states, are aware that it is going to take time to build production capacity and processing capacity of cocoa in these two countries and in the region, but it has to be done. And we know that there will be success. We know this from the experience of Gabon. When Gabon ceased exporting raw timber and decided that as part of the strategy of Gabon of industrial development, that all raw timber will be processed in Gabon, which happened 12, 15 years ago. And today, Gabon is one of the leading exporters of high-end furniture that is manufactured in that country. And so as a result of these success stories on the continent, it is important that as we roll out our strategy for value chain and productive capacity improvement, that we look to these successes as models in areas such as the automotive sector, agro-processing, pharmaceuticals, and transport and logistics. If we take, for example, pharmaceuticals, in the year 2019, our continent imported $15 billion worth of pharmaceutical products. This is a huge amount, and it demonstrates two things. First, it demonstrates, of course, lack of productive capacity in the area of pharmaceuticals. Second, it demonstrates, sadly so, that the public health needs of the African continent have to rely on global value chains, and that access to public health is reliant on the availability of these pharmaceutical products that come from other parts of the world. And so through the identification of these four value chains, the automotive sector, agro-processing, pharmaceuticals, transport and logistics, we hope that we will take the first steps to reduce and reverse this trend of over-reliance on the import of pharmaceutical products that are key to driving Africa's industrialization, where we establish a generic drug industry, that are key to improving public health in Africa, that are key to ensuring that we have access to affordable health care for millions and millions of Africans. Our studies project that where we implement these value chains and the strategies that underpin them, we have the potential to contribute over $11 billion annually in production and over $5 billion annually in intra-Africa trade, more than doubling the current contribution of these value chains that I've just listed to intra-Africa trade. And more importantly, that we will be in a position where we implement these value chains to create over 700,000 jobs, 55% of which will be women and youth. And so clearly the AfCFTA has to be more than just a traditional trade agreement, which we know traditional trade agreements and the constraints that they have. We have tried to distinguish this agreement from any other trade agreement, and I'm very happy that Professor David Luke is with you because he is one of the main architects of the AfCFTA and its conception from the very, very early stages when we started the negotiations process way back in 2010, 2011 in Accra, Ghana. So we have to be more than a trade agreement. We have to have tools that support implementation of the trade agreement. That is why we have introduced a payment system to enable and facilitate trade, the Pan-African payments system, which we have launched recently with Afreximbank. And that is why we are working actively to ensure that we have a trade finance facility to make sure that small medium enterprises and young entrepreneurs, that they are part of the benefits of the AfCFTA. Now, as I conclude, let me conclude where I started. And where I started is the nexus that you laid out of peace, health, and of course, from our context, economic integration. We have seen from the pandemic that public health is a very important factor of a country's economic activity. And we've also seen how intellectual property rights have an impact on public health. That is why the AfCFTA Secretariat and the member states, we have started negotiating the protocol on intellectual property rights. And our objective is really very simple in this protocol. It is to ensure that whatever provisions we finally agreed to in the agreement, but they must support industrial development in Africa. That is to say, the development and the establishment of a generic drug industry. They must support access to affordable health care in the form of vaccines, the manufacturing of vaccines. Today, less than 10% of Africans are vaccinated. And so we must establish a legal framework for the service of Africa's public health. We've tried this at the WTO many years ago. We tried to introduce reforms in public health, in the TRIPS agreement, but we did not succeed. Not for lack of trying, but because others did not share our objective. They did not share our objective that even in the middle of a public health crisis, that we must look at how patents, how we can use patents to address a public health crisis. That did not happen. It happened in a very, very narrow sense. The reforms that we attempted to introduce were not supported by others. And so I hope that now that we have confronted a public health crisis that is in many respects unprecedented, that we will recognize the need to have an intellectual property rights regime at the center of that particular regime must be, from our perspective, it must be saving lives of Africans. That should be the primary objective, and not profiteering and making billions and billions of dollars when people are dying. So we will confront this reality of patents and how patents are deployed, or how they should be deployed in the context of a global public health crisis, we must have this very frank and robust discussion about how we use intellectual property rights when confronted with a public health crisis. In the area of peace, we know that Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, has clearly, one of the overriding objectives is the attainment of a peaceful and prosperous continent. That is why the AfCFTA is one of the flagship projects as a bridge to take us and to deliver us to that objective of a prosperous and peaceful Africa. We also know that when trade introduces opportunities, economic opportunities, when trade introduces and presents people with jobs, that leads to less incidents of insecurity. That leads to a more stable region and more stable countries. And so clearly, there is a facilitating and contributing role of trade to peace and economic and prosperity and stability in terms of security in a particular region or indeed in a country. Where we provide opportunities that are created by trade, the lack of the current challenges that we confront today, such as extremism, particularly amongst young Africans, attraction to terrorism, where we provide opportunities, where we provide jobs, where we give small medium enterprises that are led by young people opportunities to expand their businesses to other parts of the continent or other parts of the world, that this has a very, very positive impact on peace and stability. And so the AfCFTA clearly must play a role in that, and the AfCFTA must be a platform for the achievement of the overall objective of peace and security on the African continent, and that is Agenda 2063. And so we are looking forward very much. It has been only 2 years since the establishment of the AfCFTA Secretariat, but we very much look forward to how this Secretariat and how this AfCFTA presents an opportunity to the continent to lift itself from the current condition that it has been in for the last 65 years or so, as I mentioned, and to make sure that we have a more integrated economic system, and that we transform the face and the character of Africa's economy from that of being an exporter of raw materials to industrialization and to value-added production. It is going to take time, of course. It is not going to happen overnight. We know this from the experience of other parts of the world. We know it from the experience of the European Union, that market integration is a long-term objective and that it takes time and discipline to get there. And so once again, I want to thank you very much for inviting me today, and I wish you the best as you, in a very noble objective of uplifting and enhancing knowledge about Africa and Africa's trade policy in not only here at the London School of Economics, but also around the world through the networks that the London School of Economics has around the world. Thank you very much.